Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi, to the third part of my video series on the best team for each carry. And today we're going to be talking about Dendro carries. There are not that many dedicated carries in the Dendro element because of the design and balance of Dendro reactions. And so because of that, I've decided that the Dendro carries video is also going to have Hyper Bloom teams and Burgeon teams and Bloom teams. What we're going to start with is Kinich. So, quick reminder for what Kinich does. Kinich's skill makes him spin around enemies, charge up his Scale Spiker shot by filling up his Night Soul bar. Once the Night Soul bar is full, he can use his Scale Spiker shot to deal massive damage, and then start charging it up again by spinning. Kinich is a character that has fairly high motion value with pretty average ICD stuff, which means that he is pulled in the direction of teams that focus on buffing him more than teams that focus on reactions. But talent level 9 Kinich skill, 1168% motion value. Talent level 10, 1237. This number's pretty big, and you can get multiple of them per rotation. But how many of them can you get? By default, you can get 2 to 3. If all you do is spin around and go to the blind spot zones, one, two, can't get the third one here. That being said, you can speed up his Scale Spiker shot animation time by, instead of tapping the skill, holding it and immediately releasing it. When the Scale Spiker shot is ready, you can hold it to aim. But if you start holding and immediately release, it's actually faster than if you just tap. In other words, you can get 3 tap skills by default, as long as you go towards the blind spot and you do a short hold on his skill. That's not the only way though. His burst pauses his skill timer, but he still generates Night Soul from the Night Soul generation over time during the burst animation, which means that if you burst in the middle of your skill, it helps you get that third one more easily, even without doing a short hold. You might be able to get 3 like this. Obviously though, that's just by default, using the blind spots. But Kinich has 2 ways of generating additional Night Soul, right? The blind spot, but also reactions. Burning and Burgeon. And with Burning and Burgeon, you generate more Night Soul, so you can end up with more total Scale Spiker shots. The question is, how many can you get? By default, if you just do the tap skill on Kinich, with Burning on the enemy, you can get 4, but you won't be able to get a 5th one. If you do the same thing, but you add a burst in the middle, you'll be able to get 5. You can also you can get 5 a lot more reliably by doing short hold. And if you're good enough, you can even get 5 without using the burst if you're doing short hold. However, it's difficult. And that's really where a lot of the variance in Kinich teams comes from. If you're able to reliably get 5 shots, Kinich is a fairly strong carry. But keep in mind, with your shots dealing so much more damage than your pew-pews in between, losing 1 shot is effectively the equivalent of losing a 5th of your damage almost. A little bit less, but still. And because Kinich teams often have a few characters buffing him, rather than doing that much off-field damage, that's a pretty big hit to your team DPS. Now, why am I bringing this up in the video about the best teams for each carry? It's because the difficulty of getting the maximum amount of shots for Kinich is very dependent on which teams it is. In other words, getting 5 shots in a burning team is not the same level of difficulty as getting 3 shots in a team that doesn't have a favorable reaction, or getting 4 shots in a burgeon team. In my experience, the hardest one is the 5 shots in a burning team. Technically, I think 6 shots is possible if you do frame perfect short holds and you use the burst, but I've never managed to do it a single time. And even with as good as humanly possible reaction time, you have to wait a little bit in between firing your shot and pew-pewing if you want to guarantee that you're going in the right direction for the blind spot, which means that you won't be able to do frame perfect stuff unless you rely on 50-50ing the blind spot in the same direction as you're going. Anyway, 5 shots, in my experience, is actually fairly difficult to do in his burning teams. In the non-reaction teams, or like the teams where you don't have burning or burgeon, it's a lot easier to get to the upper limit because you don't have to deal with the RNG of the blind spot or perfect reaction time, because the slower Night Soul generation means that even if you go in the wrong direction for the blind spot, you can just change direction afterwards and get to the blind spot before it gets to the point where your Night Soul bar would have been full if you went to the blind spot initially. And so it's more reliable for that one, but you're still reliant on doing cancels. And finally, in burgeon teams, you tend to be able to do 4 very reliably, even without short hold cancels. And 5 is pretty much too unreliable. And so when I do my assumptions for Kinich teams, what I'm assuming is for the burning teams, 5E, for the burgeon, 4E, and for the other teams, 3E. But 5E here is quite difficult. 4E here is pretty easy, and 3E here is medium difficulty. And what that means is that a lot of people are not going to get this. They're actually going to get 4E in this team and 2E in this one. And that's going to significantly impact the ranking of his teams relative to one another. With all of that out of the way, let's talk about those teams. When it comes to his burning teams, what are your options? Kinich, as I've mentioned earlier, is a character who doesn't care too much about reaction damage. What he cares about is getting the burning for Night Soul generation, but burning damage isn't helping. Burning reaction doesn't give you an aura for anything important for him. It's just for his passive, which means that the teammates that are good with him are going to be very straightforward. It's just going to be characters that either give him buffs or deal damage themselves. So what are the characters that give him buffs or deal damage themselves that will work with him? Obvious ones, Bennett. Bennett is giving you pretty big attack buff for Kinich. Emily gives you all field damage with effectively the same condition as Kinich, which means that if you're fulfilling the burning condition for Kinich, you're also fulfilling the burning condition for Emily. Xiangling helps you with your burning uptime, gives you a bit of damage. Eon-san, pretty big attack buff, and Kinich moves enough to keep her buff capped out pretty easily. Mawika, similar reason to Xiangling, with an additional damage percent buff. And that's pretty much it for like the obvious ones. But that's not where it ends, because obviously none of these characters give you defensive utility outside of healing, right? You don't have any external source of resistance to interruption, which means that if you're struggling defensively, you can also consider more defensive focused options like Deya, Toma, Xinyan. Here's the thing though. When it comes to burning enemies, they have the Dendro aura applied by your Dendro characters, which is just going to be whatever amount of Dendro you're applying. And while enemies are burning, that Dendro aura is the fuel for the burning, so it gets depleted fairly quickly. You also have the Pyro aura from your Pyro characters. But then on top of those two, you also have a special burning aura. And that burning aura is stronger than pretty much every source of Pyro aura you can get. It's an untaxed 2 units of Pyro, which effectively means you have a strong Pyro aura that won't necessarily disappear if you trigger reactions. And that special burning aura allows you to use certain characters that are not Dendro Pyro without losing your Pyro or burning aura, and therefore without losing the Night Soul you need on Kinich. Good example of that, the Auroron. Auroron has some off-field Electro, but it's not the fastest. Because your burning aura is significantly stronger than the average Pyro aura, as long as you have some additional off-field Pyro, you can use characters like Auroron that don't have insanely fast off-field application and still have good burning uptime. So what are those characters that are potential considerations that don't ruin your team and that do have some synergy with Kinich's teams? So we've already said Auron. You can consider Fischl, though it's a little more questionable. You can use cryo characters if you want. The fact that Kinich can slot in cryo characters means that he doesn't get punished too hard when enemies have cryo needs, like against the Swan Knee, for example. Kinich was pretty good in that Swan Knee abyss. Once Escoffier comes out, you'll be able to use Escoffier. Tighnari, who's less about the damage, but does give you a buff and potentially allow you to meld Mawika if you're using Tighnari and Mawika, but at that point, that's barely a Kinich team anymore. I'd say that, as a general rule, Kinich's best team is his burning team options. But that's assuming you do 5e. If you don't do 5e, there's actually not that much of a difference between the burning Kinich teams and his more weird team options that include other stuff. You look at the Burgeon teams, or like the pseudo-Burgeon teams with Farina, and they're not that far behind. Now, dedicated Burgeon, right? A team where you have like a Pyro character with relatively slow application, so you can trigger enough blooms, and a Hydro character with fast application. So something like this, for example, unfortunately isn't that good. But teams that are not really Burgeon teams, but rather just teams with the units that work well with Kinich, that just so happens to have some Burgeons in them, like this one, are actually fairly good. And finally, for Kinich, you have the non-burning team options, and I think they're underrated. I don't think they're necessarily as good as the burning teams, but I think they're a lot closer to the burning teams than most people realize. So what are your options for the non-burning Kinich teams? Mainly, it's Quicken teams and Hyperloom teams, or Quake Bloom teams. So you're either doing something with Fischl or Auron, with the last slot being somewhat flexible with like maybe Nahida, maybe Zhongli, maybe Bennett. These teams are a bit weaker than the burning teams, but if you need Bennett on your other side, they're not bad. The damage that Kinich gets from the Quicken Aura isn't that much, but he still gets reasonable personal damage just from his outright motion value, and both Fischl and Auron are doing a decent amount of damage thanks to the Quicken Aura and the amount of aggravates they're triggering, which makes those teams pretty reasonable options. And obviously you have the Hyper Bloom stuff with like something like this, which aren't really teams that are that synergistic with Kinich, but the Hyperloom 3-unit core is fairly strong, and Kinich has okay synergy in this team because he uses enough normal attack inputs to get a good amount of rain swords. Even if his skill isn't normal attack damage, it still counts as a normal attack input for Singto Burst. And just in terms of DPS, these teams are not far behind Kinich's optimal burning teams. They can start being noticeably behind with like perfectly min-maxed Kinich teams with Mawiko where you reliably get 5 skills. But like I was talking about earlier, it's difficult to reliably get 5 skills, and they're actually not that far behind 4 skills even with Mawiko. All of that being said though, this is assuming KQM standard level investment, which is effectively pretty decent but not outstanding artifacts, 4-star weapons, C0 characters. And the presence of constellations and or very, very good artifacts can skew things and change the way teams relate to one another. Hyperbloom specifically is an archetype that gets stronger from one stat mainly for the Hyperbloom damage, which is EM, and where that stat falls off pretty heavily once you start having a lot of it, because it's not a linear formula for EM for reaction damage with EM. And so because of that, the stat assumptions for KQM standard Hyperbloom are pretty favorable. At least on your Hyperbloom damage specifically, you'll get like 90% of a perfect build. Whereas on characters that deal talent damage, that scale with crit, that scale with like either attack, HP, or defense, because you're scaling from multiple different things and they're at least pseudo-linear or better in terms of how they scale once you stack a lot of them, and because those stats multiply together, it effectively means that KQM standard level investment is pretty far behind what a perfect build would be. We can actually take a look at what happens if you take KQM standard Kinich and you replace it with perfect artifacts Kinich, near perfect artifacts Kinich. Let's assume 30 crit rolls, 4 attack rolls. So Kinich personal damage, 63k. If we go from that to near perfect artifacts, 63k becomes 73k. Anyways, his damage goes up by like 15%, going from Kikyo Standard to Near Perfect Artifacts. And if you look at Hyper Bloom, right, Raiden damage 37.7, and if we change this 240 EM, 120 EM on Flower and Feather, goes up to 39.7 KM. And so it's a 5% increase. So all of this to say, if you're a very, very dedicated Kinich player, you really do want to lean into the like intended playstyle for him with Burning. But if Kinich is just one of the many characters you have and you like him, but not enough to stay stuck in Obsidian Codex for the rest of your life and get cons on him or whatever, no, you can do Hyper Bloom, and it's not actually that much worse unless you're at really, really high investment. Yeah, that pretty much does it for Kinich. So now let's talk about Alhaitham. Outside of Kinich and Alhaitham, there aren't really any proper dedicated Dendro carries that aren't kind of ass. Alhaitham is a character who has attack and EM scaling directly, and on top of that, he also increases his own damage percent based on his EM. So he effectively double dips on his EM in terms of how it increases his damage. So because of that, you're incentivized to build a lot of EM on him. And on top of that, he also has a pretty good ICD on his things. Alhaitham's damage comes from a mix of his normal and charge attacks and his mirror coordinated attacks. Those mirror coordinated attacks happen from doing normal and charge attacks, and they hit a different amount of times depending on how many mirrors you have. He gains 1 or 2 mirrors from using skill, 2 if you start from 0, 1 if you're not at 0. He gains 1 mirror from charge or plunge attacks, up to once every 12 seconds, and he basically reverses his mirrors. He mirrors his mirrors when he uses burst. So if he's at 0 when he uses it, he gains 3. If he's at 1, he goes to 2. If he's at 2, he goes to 1. And if he's at 3, he goes to 0. His skill cooldown is 18 seconds. Burst cooldown, 18 seconds. And passive cooldown on the mirror from plunge or charge attack is 12. All of these things together mean that he effectively has 2 main ways of being played. Option number 1, you start with your burst, so you can immediately start with 3 mirrors. You attack until you get close to 2, and then you do a charge attack to get your mirror back. Keep attacking, and then do a skill to get your mirror back from the skill. Now, your skill and your burst cooldown are the same amount, and your passive cooldown is shorter, which means that doing something like this, you can generally get 2 mirror procs per like mirror generation. But yeah, so this is his default combo, right? You burst, and then you start attacking, get 1 proc, get a 2nd proc, do a charge attack to refresh, get a 3rd proc, get a 4th proc, do a skill to refresh, get a 5th proc, and then get a 6th proc. And then you can optionally keep going with 2 mirror procs and 1 mirror procs, but you can get a total of 6 instances of a 3 mirror proc. That's the first way you can play him. But it's not the only one, because his passive cooldown is 12 seconds, not 18. What that means is that you can adapt your rotation and split up his uptime in 2. If the supports you're using allow for you to do rotations that are longer, if you're using Fischl, for example, who has a 12-second duration Oz that you can do twice, lines up very well with 25-second rotations, you can split up Alhaitham's uptime in 2, and if you do, you can get 2 procs of this. And what that allows you to do is, because when you start from 0, your skill gives you 2 instead of 1 mirror, and because if you hold his skill, it always puts you in the air, even if you hold it while aiming at the ground. You can do a plunge attack like that, and that plunge attack gives you the mirror and procs your first mirror. And then you can get a 2nd one. And then optionally keep going on 2 mirrors. And then swap out, go refresh whatever buffs you have, and then back to him. And you can get another 2 mirror procs, and then do a charge attack to refresh your mirror. And you can still end up getting 4 procs of the 3 mirror coordinated attack. So you still end up with a total of 6 3-mirror attacks. The advantage of something like this is obviously that you get to split your uptime, and splitting your uptime allows you to go refresh buffs or refresh off-field damage abilities. In practice, a lot of Alhaitham teams do the single uptime rotation, and a lot do the split uptime rotation. And the main factor that decides which one you do tends to be whether Fischl is on the team or not. Even when you do single uptime, or when you do split uptime, you often stay on Alhaitham and do some 2-mirror attacks instead of 3-mirror attacks. 3-mirror attacks are much better because of his ICD. Alhaitham's internal cooldown is weird. His time rule is basically infinite amount of time. So you can effectively think of him as not having a time rule and only having a hit rule, which means his ICD is decided entirely by the number of coordinated attacks. Which means when you get 3 mirrors instead of 2, you get 3 hits instead of 2, which means you get 50% more spreads. You'll get spread on the first hit, then on the third hit for the first mirror proc, and then the second mirror proc, you'll get spread on the 5th hit. You get 3 spreads every 2 mirror procs at 3 mirrors. Then same thing again, and once you fall to 2 mirrors, you only get 1 per proc. It's still not bad to do 2 mirror procs, but it is noticeably worse. On top of the fact that you obviously have 1 less hit of the damage. Anyways, Alhaitham is not a character that has particularly outstanding ratios or like ICD that allow him to have an incredible amount of personal damage. If you look at the Alhaitham teams that are the most focused on his personal damage, which are his Quicken teams, obviously, or maybe the Quigbloom teams with good Electro uptime. So the reality is that 45k is not enough to solo carry a team anymore. And what that means is that you're gonna need to have your team built in a way where you don't need to rely entirely on Alhaitham's damage to clear things. But that actually makes a lot of sense. When you look at the way that reactions work, for most reactions, it's fairly straightforward. You apply an element, it creates that aura on an enemy. So if you apply Hydro to an enemy, they now have a Hydro aura on them. After that, you apply a different element, that triggers a reaction and removes the aura. When you trigger Quicken, however, I mean, technically it does remove the aura, but it then creates a Quicken aura. And the Quicken aura does not get removed or even reduced by triggering Spread or Aggravate. And what that means is that you don't have a character on your team that's a dedicated aura character. When you're doing a Vape team, for example, if you're doing like Xingqiu Hu-Tao's reacting, Xingqiu isn't. In a Quicken team, once you've triggered Quicken once, every single Electro and Dendro application triggers, respectively, Spread and Aggravate. What that means is that by design, the Quicken reaction lends itself much better to teams that split their damage between different characters. Because you're guaranteed that every Electro and Dendro character that applies some element will be able to trigger their respective reactions. Because of that, it makes a lot of sense for a character like Alhaitham to have lower personal damage than a character like, I don't know, Arlecchino. So, how does this translate to the strengths of his team and how they compare to one another? As a Dendro character who doesn't quite have enough personal damage to solo carry a team, it effectively already disqualifies any non-reaction team. Like, Mono Dendro is not a real thing, and it also disqualifies teams where you rely heavily on stat buffs, like the teams you do for Kinich, for example. So what's left? Well, what's left is the Dendro reaction teams, with the Dendro reactions that actually do damage, which means Hyperbloom, Burgeon, Quicken, and Nilo. Let's get Burgeon out of the way. Burgeon kind of sucks. We still don't have characters that are actually properly dedicated to the Burgeon reactions. And so what's left is Hyperbloom, Quicken, and Nilo Bloom. The most popular Alhaitham teams are the Hyperbloom ones. Hyperbloom or Quigbloom. Quigbloom is effectively a Hyperbloom team where your Hydro application is slow enough that you don't wipe out your Quicken aura too quickly and you still trigger some spreads and aggravates. And most people end up playing Alhaitham in Alhaitham, Kuki, Nahida, Hydro. With that Hydro slot being anything that has off-field Hydro, whether it's something like Xingqiu that allows you to have more Hyperbloom damage with very fast Hydro, or something like Farina that allows you to have more Quicken damage with the damage percent buff and the slower Hydro, but less Hyperbloom damage. And honestly, those teams are pretty similar to one another. The Farina teams are a little bit stronger in terms of damage, but obviously you have a lot less defensive utility, and you're a lot more reliant on your mirror damage. So if you get staggered or whatever, you get punished harder. All in all, if you like Alhaitham, these are generally the teams I would recommend. But there are also teams that don't have that much personal damage coming from Alhaitham. Even the ones with Farina have Alhaitham doing like 30% of the team DPS. And so if you want a team where Alhaitham is the one actually carrying the team, even if it's not 100% of the team DPS, if you want his personal damage to be as high as it possibly can, you'll want to look at the Quicken teams, which are worse than the Hyperbloom teams, but they're not that much worse. The biggest downside when it comes to Quick and Alhaitham teams is that as of early May 2025, we don't really have Dendro or Electro units that are specifically targeting spread as a team archetype. There aren't really Electro or Dendro units outside of Alhaitham himself, or like I guess Tighnari to some extent, but like there aren't really supports that have particularly great synergy in Quicken teams that focus on Dendro damage dealers. We don't have Electro buffers that give good buffs to Dendro carries. We don't have Electro off-fielders that have good synergy with the Dendro on-fielders. When you look at the Quicken teams, the more popular ones, it's mostly the Electro carries, and the main reason for that is because of Fischl. Fischl's Ascension 4 passive, it hits with Electro when you trigger an Electro-related reaction, but because of the way that Quicken works, like I said earlier, your hits don't wipe out your aura, which effectively means that because Fischl's A4 doesn't have ICD, every time you trigger an Electro-related reaction, you get an additional hit and aggravate from Fischl. So every aggravate that you get on your carry effectively becomes 2 aggravates. One on your carry, one on Fischl. And because of that, when you look at the Quicken team damage distributions, the ones with Electro carries, alright, with Sethos, Fischl doing 40% of the team DPS, Kaveh, Fischl doing over 40% of the team DPS. Point being, Fischl does a lot for those quick and focused Electro carries. The thing is, spread is not coded as an Electro-related elemental reaction. Dendro isn't reacting with Electro, it's reacting with Quicken. And Quicken is not an Electro aura. Which means that while Electro carries get a lot of Fischl A4 procs, because Aggravate is an Electro reaction, it's Electro on Quicken, Dendro carries don't. The only way that a Dendro carry will end up triggering Fischl's Ascension 4 is if you have so much off-field Electro that you end up with a hidden underlying Electro aura inside the Quicken, and you end up triggering both Quicken and spread with your Dendro attack. But with Alhaitham, because his Dendro is so fast, that's never happening, right? In a Kaveh team, Fischl's Ascension 4 is doing 15k DPS, 16k DPS. In an Alhaitham team, less than 5k. It's almost 4 times less. You get the point, right? Fischl is a very good off-field damage dealer for Electro carries in Quicken teams, but not for Dendro carries. And unfortunately, there is no Electro or Dendro character that does anywhere near as much for spread teams as Fischl does in aggravate teams. Which effectively means the lack of strong synergistic supports forces you to play either weak supports or unsynergistic strong supports. In my opinion, the current strongest Alhaitham Quicken team is Alhaitham, Nahida, Fischl, Eonsan. Eonsan gives an attack buff, which doesn't do that much for Alhaitham, but Eonsan is very strong, and with the damage buff from Cinder City, and with the fact that Fischl actually benefits from that attack buff, it's still pretty good. And then Fischl doesn't get a lot of aggravate damage, but she's still good enough to be better than your other alternatives. Those teams tend to be a bit worse than the Hyperloom teams, and they're a lot harder to play. Right, like I said earlier, when you're using Fischl as a significant source of damage in your team, you're reliant on getting 2 Oz's per rotation, which means you have to do the split uptime rotations, which punish you a lot harder for doing, or for making mistakes in your rotations. You can use other Electro units. You can use characters like Yai, like Kuki, Lisa. You can use Beto. She's pretty decent defensive utility. But unfortunately, those characters are all quite a bit weaker. Kuki's not a bad character, but in Quicken, she does a lot less. And so you'll find yourself in a situation where it's not all that great. And finally, the last sort of Alhaitham teams is Nilo teams. And I will say, I do think people slightly underestimate Alhaitham with Nilo. In my eyes, I feel like if you're going for Alhaitham, why the f are you putting him on a Nilo team? And if you're going for Nilo, why the f are you using Alhaitham? When you look at Nilo teams and how they perform compared to one another, the reality is that there's honestly not that much difference between all your Nilo options in AoE, as long as you're using Nilo plus Nahida. Technically, if you're assuming unrealistic bullshit with Syncto orbitals, Syncto is like significantly ahead of the other Hydros, but honestly, I don't think that's something that you should assume realistically. The biggest problem you can encounter in Nilo teams is what happens if you don't have Nahida. If you don't have Nahida, your Nilo teams tank. They become so much worse. And in my eyes, that's where Alhaitham comes in. the teams that use Alhaitham with like Xingqiu Yao Yao or some shit like that aren't that much worse than the Nahida ones. They are worse. You are better off using Nahida. But for someone who doesn't have Nahida and wants to use something else, Alhaitham is actually a fairly decent option in a team like this. Obviously, him having actual field time requirements means that your healing has to come from an off-field character rather than an on-field one, so you can't really use on-field Kokomi stuff that you can do with Nahida, but that is potentially not that big of a problem. In terms of how the Alhaitham teams for Nilo compared to non-Nilo Alhaitham teams, as a general rule, they're worse in single target and they're not noticeably better in AoE. So to me, it's more something you do if you want to play Nilo but you don't have Nahida than something you do to make Alhaitham good in AoE, because it's not even that much better in AoE than his default teams. And so, overall conclusion on Alhaitham, his best team is either Hyper Bloom or Quick Bloom, but you can make him work in both Quicken and Nilo, depending on what exactly you want out of him. I guess one thing that's also worth mentioning, if you do not own Nahida for Alhaitham, his best team is generally going to be Hyper Bloom, whether you do double Hydro or single Hydro with Fischl. You can also do double Dendro with a defensive option. Next is Kaveh. Kaveh isn't that bad. Like, Kaveh's bad, don't get me wrong, but he's not that bad. Kaveh's ICD is not all that great. Kaveh's motion value is pretty dog shit. What does Kaveh have going for him? Self-healing. And that's pretty much it. What that means is that he can fulfill the role of your healer in a Nilo team, but only self-healing and only in teams where you get your applications from off-field characters. Technically, though, Kaveh is part of Nilo's best team at C0 because of how powerful Xingqiu can be in the optimal case scenario with Nilo, because Nahida's a lot better than the alternatives. You're kind of already committed to Nilo, Xingqiu, Nahida, and neither of those three characters need to be on field to do their job, which means that a character that needs to be on field to do their job isn't a downside for the last slot. And in a case like that, using Kaveh as your healing option instead of Baiju just outright is more damage and also better AoE application. But there's also an incredibly small difference between using Kaveh and using pretty much anything else in those teams, so he's far from important. And his lack of team-wide healing makes him harder to pilot, because damage you take on Nahida, Xingqiu, and Nilo is effectively permanent, unless you get Xingqiu orbital healing on them, which won't happen, be honest with yourself. Outside of Nilo team, Kaveh is effectively just a Dendro on-fielder with very little damage. You don't really want to use him in Quicken teams because he has the same problems as Alhaitham, but on top of that, he does pretty much no damage himself, so he's just going to be significantly worse. In Hyperloom teams, you can use him because he has enough application to be useful, but it is less application than a character like Alhaitham, so it's worse. And his skill and burst make bloom seeds explode, so if you're hitting seeds with them, you get a bloom instead of a hyper bloom, but your hydro characters aren't built with EM, so your blooms don't do that much damage, on top of the fact that bloom base damage is lower than hyper bloom. And then outside of that, you can do him in Pyro Plunge, I guess, because he's a melee character, and technically Kaveh is the Claymore character that has the fastest plunge animation, but Xianyun only lets you do 8 plunges anyways, and even characters with slower plunges don't tend to struggle to get all 8, so it doesn't really matter. Which means the only real upside of Plunge Kaveh, you get to see the funny little ooh ouchie animation that he does after a plunge attack. Next up is Tighnari. Now, I'm sure there was a few people that when I said that Alhaitham was the second and pretty much last real Dendro carry, give me a side eye. Maybe went down to the comments and started angrily typing correction, a mean message. Here's the thing about Tighnari. The unfortunate reality with him is that even if you give Tighnari pretty much all the buffs you can give him, the total output that you can get from him is barely on the same level as good off-fielders. Tighnari is a character who is designed to function in quick swap teams, right? By default, Tighnari can do a skill, a burst, and then 3 quick charge shots. But after that, he just stares at the enemy. Getting an unbuffed charge shot on Tighnari takes way too long to even be worth considering. So you get the 3 charge shots from his skill, and that's it. So what that means is that he can spend, I'm going to swap into him at 55. Right? He gets like about 5 seconds of uptime. That was not perfect gameplay at all. You can get it in a little less than that. I'll swap at 57 then. It's still about 5 because I'm not particularly good. Anyways, here's the thing though. Let's assume perfect case scenario for him. When it comes to his personal damage, what's the like upper limit that you'll be able to get? It'll probably be something with Nahida, Lisa. Let's assume Eon-san. Why not? So, in a team like this, the very, very upper limit to his damage is around 1 million at like reasonable assumption for standard character constellation of C2 with signature. But the thing is, you can't do that off cooldown, which means that the actual DPS isn't particularly impressive. In practice, you obviously don't do a team like this. But the unfortunate reality for Tighnari is that he just doesn't have enough personal damage for teams that focus mainly on his personal damage to be all that good, right? Kind of like Alhaitham, but he just has significantly less damage than Alhaitham, with the upside of having lower field time requirements. The problem is, the only characters that benefit from your carry having lower field time requirements are other characters that have enough field time requirement for it to be a potential downside, but not so much that they're like a dedicated carry. Other quick swappy characters, like Yai, for example. But the problem is, Yai also has pretty underwhelming numbers all around. Basically, Tighnari is a character that has perfect synergy with quick swap quicken rotations, but doesn't have the numbers to back it up. That synergy is so good that those quicken teams aren't that bad, but his numbers are so bad that despite the amazing synergy, they're not even the best quicken teams. In other words, Tighnari is a character that doesn't really have much room for improvement because he already has the perfect teammates. What he doesn't have is good numbers. But in the current context of the game, where your other spread options don't have good teammates, his teams are somewhat competitive despite being a little bit worse. So what are the Tighnari teams you can do? You've got two main ways of going about it, right? Unlike Alhaitham, his application is not AoE, so he doesn't work for shit in Nilo teams. You're pretty much only left with Quicken and Hyperbloom. Unlike Alhaitham, he's not a normal attacker, so he works a lot worse with Singto. And unlike Alhaitham, he's not melee, so he doesn't quite work as well with Kuki either. Despite all of that, his best team on paper is still Hyperbloom with Kuki, Nahida, Farina. But that's assuming you're staying close enough to enemies to proc the Hyperbloom. Personally, I also kind of like using Raiden Baiju instead. I actually like it more. It's pretty fun to play, but it's not a particularly strong team. Other than that, you can do teams with Yai. But something that I find very, very tragic for Tighnari is that in a lot of his teams, his best set is Instructor because his personal damage output is actually low enough that getting the Instructor buff for the rest of your team is outright better than getting better stats on him. On the Farina team, Marishal's is his best set, but on the Quicken teams, it's actually slightly better to go Instructor on him. You can also use him with Sethos instead of Yai, in a similar vein where like Sethos has kind of flexible rotations where he won't necessarily spend that much time on field in a row, but it's worse than using Yai, and Tighnari is a lot worse than using the other Dendros. Anyways, that's pretty much it for Tighnari teams, which leaves us with the last Dendro quote-unquote carry I want to talk today, Nahida. And this is where we start talking about the Hyperbloom teams that don't have a dedicated carry. Very quickly, I'll mention Burgeon teams. Don't play them. Burgeon teams aren't necessarily awful, but they are significantly weaker than Hyperbloom teams, and with Abyss HP getting higher and higher, with Abyss being more and more single target oriented, Burgeon teams that have lower DPS and slightly better AoE coverage are falling behind, and they weren't all that good to begin with. But Hyperbloom is kind of goated. I think people are tired of Hyperbloom, and I understand. But I also think that at this point, people perceive Hyperbloom to be worse than it actually is. Hyperbloom is still very much good enough to clear content, and it tends to be pretty versatile. It doesn't really get countered by anything. Current Abyss is a bit harsher for Hyperbloom than the usual one, because of Hydro immune enemies. But as it turns out, it's hard to like hard counter Hyperbloom. Hyperbloom is also very easy to play and gets to a large percentage of its power very early into your account progression, because once you've secured your EM main stats, the substats literally don't matter for your Hyperbloom damage because you can't roll EM substat on an EM main stat. And while the rest of your team does scale with crit stats and whatever in the same way that other teams do, when you look at the damage distribution of these Hyperbloom teams, this is the random input one, the sim that rolls a number from 1 to 4, swaps to that character, uses whatever's available, and then do that again, right? So 30k DPS just from Hyperbloom. Technically, it's actually 26k with like 3k electro charge damage, but you get the point, man. All this to say, even on enemies that have high hydro resistance or hydro immune entirely, and also even if the rest of your team has pretty dog shit builds, you still get honestly not that far from a decently invested Hyperbloom team's damage, which means that when it comes to your early account progression, Hyperbloom will be the best team you can do on your account for a while. On top of that, units nowadays are very, very often designed in a way that's different from what it used to be. Recent carries tend to have numbers high enough that even average buffs tend to do more for your team DPS than characters that give you off-field damage. There's a few exceptions here and there, but it often tends to be the case because of power creep that you lean more towards supports and off-fielders that give buffs than ones that have that much personal damage, at least when it comes to the old ones. And what that means is that there's less and less teams that are competing for Xingqiu and for Yilan. In other words, if what you're playing is a more recent carry, if you're playing Baresa, if you're playing Awika, if you're playing even Arlecchino to some extent, if you're playing Neuvillette, all 4 of those units are free. You're not really using them for those teams. If you don't have Yilan, you can also use Fischl here. Although Fischl is a bit more contested for at least the Chevreuse teams, so the Pyro carries, but the recent shift to a lot more buff-focused off-fielders rather than damage-focused ones has significantly reduced the competition for those old, strong off-fielders like Xingqiu and Yilan, which makes it so that it's a lot easier to have all the units available to do Hyperbloom. On top of that, we've had new endgame mode leakers, and if they are to be believed, it'll be a piece of content where you need 3 different teams rather than 2, and so the lower competition for those units is going to matter even more. When it comes to team building, it's incredibly straightforward for Hyperbloom. You want Nahida, because Nahida applies so much more Dendro and does so much more for your team than every other Dendro character. You want someone that can trigger Hyperbloom, ideally without having ER requirements, so you can build full EM on them. The best ones for that are Raiden and Kuki. Raiden hits faster and has longer uptime with a shorter cooldown and gives you a damage percent buff to your burst on your team. Kuki heals, so you can choose based off of that. And then you want a Hydro unit, usually defaulting to Xingqiu is the right play. And you have quite a bit of flexibility on your last slot. You can go for something that's focused on defensive utility, something like Zhongli, something like Tighnari, indirect defensive utility through Freeze with Hyper Fridge, with Aya, Grizzly, whatever. Or you can go for a more offensive focused last slot. The best 2 offensive focused last slots by a reasonable margin are Yilan and Fischl. There's actually not that big of a difference between Yilan and Fischl in the last slot. So when you're against Hydro immune enemies, you can focus on Fischl. If you're against an electro-resistant enemy, you can use Yilan. Yeah, the main reason why Fischl is good is because, while technically Oz can hit Hyperloom Seeds, it doesn't happen that often. But Fischl's fast electro means that you end up with decent quicken uptime, which makes Fischl's personal damage pretty decent. She's also helping with your energy recharge. You can also use other last slots, right? They're like, you have so much flexibility on this last slot because this 3-unit team is kind of generally strong enough. So if you've got Automaton check, you can use Auron. Although Auron can yoink C's a lot more than Fischl does, so it's a bit more sus. You can use the Onson if you want, why not? You can use Shilonen, you can use Kuchina, you know, a couple abysses ago, that swirl buff abyss. You can use Sucrose. So yeah, you've got a lot of flexibility with your Hyperloom stuff. Obviously, the power creep has made Hyperloom a lot less important to accounts than it used to be, but it hasn't gotten to the point where Hyperbloom is not relevant anymore. We're still pretty far off, especially because Escoffier's release suggests to me that Skirk is going to be a carry that's pretty reliant on using Escoffier and Farina, which means that you're creating overlap in strong carries between Neuvillette and Skirk teams. is the optimal ones, but you're not really creating overlap with Hyperloom teams. Even if Skirk ends up using Yelan, the official Hyperloom team is pretty close to the Yelan Hyperloom one. But that remains to be seen. We'll have to see how things evolve in the future. And that's pretty much it for the best teams for each Dendro carry. I hope you enjoyed, hope you learned a thing or two. As usual, do all the good old YouTube stuff, like, comment, subscribe. Next one will probably be Cryo carries once Escafé comes out. So make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss that. And I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.